Good morning, welcome back to the garden. This morning I've been picking some greens for a little green smoothie we're gonna make this morning. And I gotta tell you what, I'm actually really happy with our raised bed garden this year. But I'll tell you something else. It took a lot of mistakes to get to this point. So today I wanna share with you everything I wish we hadn't done when setting up our first raised bed gardens so you can have amazing results right from the start. All right, mistake number one, and by far the biggest and most common mistake I see with new raised beds is underutilizing the space, underfilling those beds. Just imagine the scenario real quick. You put in a new raised bed, you fill it with some dirt, you're super excited to get growing, you decide what you want to grow in there, and you go look up a growing guide for that plant. And you see, hey, it says to leave about 1 foot of space between the plants and about 2 feet of space between the rows. And you look at your raised bed and you figure out, well, that means I can fit about 4 lettuce plants in there, or maybe 2 zucchini plants. Huge mistake and totally unnecessary. You can do so much more with those raised beds. Sorry to get you so up close and personal here, but I want to show you this bed as kind of a good example. After a ton of experimentation on this front, I have just become such a big fan of absolutely cramming these beds full of vegetation, full of plants. This one's got at least 75 plants in there, and it is a small raised bed. Now that's a little crazy. You don't need to go that far if you don't want to, but the point is that while each individual plant in here isn't going to get huge, although these collard greens are making a run for it, the bed as a whole is ridiculous. It is so productive. We come back here and we harvest from this bed every single day, and it is still crammed full of vegetation. Remember that when you were putting those plants in there, this isn't an in-ground garden. You spent all that time, you spent all that money filling it with soil that drains really well, that is soft and fluffy, that is probably really full of nutrients, fertilizer, compost. It can support a lot of growth. So don't make mistake number one and leave too much space between your plants in that raised bed. Fill that sucker up. So behind me here, I have a bed where the soil is full of grass seed and sulfur pellets and bark chunks, all sorts of things that don't make a lot of sense for the vast majority of plants that we want to grow. I would never grow my tomatoes and my peppers or my lettuce or my carrots, any of those really common plants in this bed. And that's because I very specifically set up this bed to grow blueberries. You can ignore the strawberries. I'm also growing in there just to see how they do. But this is a blueberry bed. That is what I designed this bed for. This is what I planned this bed for. And that's really one of the major mistakes I used to make. I would fill up the beds, I would plan out where they're going to be, I would put the dirt in them, and then I would think about what kind of plant I want to grow in there. And that's the exact opposite of how you want to do it. Now, really what you want to do is have a very good idea of the kinds of plants that you want to plant in each one of these beds ahead of time so that you can do some research on what kind of soil they're going to thrive in before you put it in there. Ultimately, it's just a fundamental limitation of a raised bed, right? Where the soil is sort of difficult to change out. It's not like a pot where I can just grab it and pour it out in one place, fix it up a little bit, and then put it back into the pot once it's right for whatever I want to grow in there. Once I put this soil in here, it's probably gonna stay how it is for a number of years, if not decades. So again, you really want to be thinking through what types of plants you're gonna put in a given location and what kind of soil they need in order to thrive. Don't be like me and try and plant your lettuce in your blueberry soil. All right, y'all, for this next one, I have a little bit of a bone to pick with all of the raised bed growing guides that I read all those years ago when I started with this style of gardening. And specifically, my grudge with those guides is they all say, for some reason, only bother putting your raised beds in areas of full sun. Don't put them in partial shade. I think that is such an enormous mistake. Take, for instance, this bed of really lank, sort of anemic onions and shallots and assorted alliums in here. Without a doubt, this bed is not growing particularly strong. The plants aren't growing very fast. I'm gonna have to wait quite a long time before I get to harvest these onions, before I get to harvest really anything out of this bed. But you know what is a lot better than waiting a long time? Not having anything here. these plants are growing. We are going to eat these plants. And even if these didn't work, that's fine. I can take them out and put something in that I know is going to work. Something like carrots or arugula that does really well in the shady parts of our garden. At the end of the day, if you have an empty spot in your garden that you wish wasn't empty, that you want to grow food in, but you aren't because it's a little bit shady, and you read that you shouldn't put raised beds in shady areas of the garden, I say forget that advice. Grab a really cheap bed, fill it with cheap soil, and experiment to your heart's desire. I made a quick video about plants that grow well for us in shady areas of the garden if you want to check that out. But if you don't, just think about the foods that you like to eat and try a bunch of them. So I've got a log right here, right, with some dubious looking mushrooms growing on there. I have absolutely no idea what kind of mushrooms those are. I did not put them there intentionally. I do not grow any kind of mushrooms, but I do have a log here. This would be the perfect material for doing something called Hugle Culture. And this is the part of the video where in most raised bed growing guides, I would say that Hugle Culture, filling the bottom of your raised bed with large chunks of woody material like this very log right here, is a great way to save money on your raised beds, to save money on filling your raised beds. Except I absolutely do not think that is the case. Now, to be clear, that is not a knock on Hugle Culture. Hugle Culture is an incredibly cool, innovative technique that makes a lot of sense in specific circumstances. But I think it's one of those ideas that has just caught fire in the gardening world and has really gotten applied very often to the concept of filling raised beds in a way that it shouldn't have. There are many, many, many better ways to fill your raised bed and fill it on a budget besides filling it up with things that are going to take years and years to break down and provide very little in the way of a viable growing medium for your plant. For instance, I like to just grab some of my native soil, put that in the bottom. It's horrible, but at least plants can grow in it. Or I'll just grab some really cheap bags of topsoil and compost from the garden center, stuff that's about $2 a cubic foot. I'll use that. Or I'll use materials that are actually going to compost in a reasonable amount of time. Things like my chicken manure from the garden or wood chips, free wood chips that I get from local arborists. This will break down very quickly in comparison to a log. All of those things, while not ideal, will actually break down and make pretty good soil that your plants can actually grow in the short term, or at least in the medium term, right? This season. Whereas this thing right here is pretty much just a viable growing medium for spider webs and mushrooms. At the end of the day, my recommendation here is just go with a shorter bed. They're so much easier to fill. They're gonna work better anyways. We already talked about that. Or if you do need a taller bed, go ahead and fill it with stuff that is cheap but viable for roots to penetrate. Things like native soil or compostable materials. I think you're going to be much, much happier that you did in those raised beds. They are going to perform much better than a bed that is full of logs. That's my view on it anyways. In fairness, it's a little bit of a contrarian view, and I will link to some Hugle Culture raised bed videos in the description below in case you want to see some other points of view. Hi there, sorry for the interruption. Real quick, a favor to ask, if you wouldn't mind, if you're enjoying this video, if you think you're learning something from this video, would you mind going ahead and hitting the thumbs up, the like button? It's going to be somewhere down below the video. I'm not actually exactly sure where. Really makes all the difference in the world to us. I really, truly appreciate it. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the raised beds. I am sitting right here in front of our new strawberry bed. I'm really excited for this, and my toddler absolutely loves growing strawberries. This is gonna be a lot of fun for us. I'm gonna go ahead and plant this little cosmos right here into this bed, although I'll probably get rid of some of these aphids first so that we are not infecting the other plants. Now, the reason that I'm doing that is because our raised bed garden, like many raised bed gardens, is going into a relatively sterile area. When we moved here 3 years ago, there was basically nothing growing here. It was just a slab of concrete and weeds. There was no reason for pollinator insects to be in this area. Now we have quite a few plants growing here. We have lots of trees. We put a lot of things in over the past few years. But as you get started with your raised bed garden, there's a good chance that you are dealing with something similar. You're putting it into an area that is otherwise fallow, empty, sterile, that doesn't have a lot of bees and other pollinator insects. So it's our job to make sure that we are attracting those insects. And one thing that you want to keep in mind is many of our favorite plants, things like tomatoes, are not all that good at attracting pollinator insects. They're not all that attractive to those insects. That was a really awkward sentence, but I hope you get the idea. So you really want to add a few other things that are really attractive. Things like this cosmos, or this, one of my absolute favorites. This is Johnny Jump Up, a tricolor viola. Whatever flowers you enjoy growing, go ahead and put them in that garden. I am a huge fan of densely planting vegetables all together and getting huge harvests. But even I think it is worth your effort, it is worth your time, and it is worth sacrificing a little bit of space in your garden to plant a few flowers. Also, I mean, it's a flower. It looks pretty good too. If you're in an urban environment or a suburban environment like we are here, try to keep in mind that many raised bed garden guides were actually written by folks with giant open spaces. Hi, buddy. Giant open spaces that need to fill those spaces, and they're actually putting together their raised bed garden in a grid fashion. Consequently, they leave 2 to 4 feet of space between those beds. Now, that's amazing if you have a lot of space to fill, or if you have specific mobility concerns that just mean that extra space makes your life more comfortable. But if you don't have a ton of space, you don't have any specific limitations, consider leaving a lot less space between your raised beds. We have about a foot here between our raised beds, and I've actually gone ahead and stuck a tree between most of our beds because I couldn't stand even having that limited one space of empty dirt. Don't get me wrong, that's a little cramped. So I'm gonna say the mistake here is not necessarily following those guides and putting 3 feet of space in between your beds, or following my guide and only putting 1 foot of space between your beds. It's not thinking through what you are actually going to need in your garden. Because let me tell you what, once you put those beds into place, it is really hard to move them later. These things are heavy. Did your parents ever tell you, do as I say, not as I do? Well, this is gonna be one of those cases because I have a totally empty, barren bed right here. And this is a disaster. This is a major mistake. I think as gardeners, we have this natural instinct, right? To never let our garden soil be totally bare. We wanna cover it up. We wanna put something there. We wanna plant in it or put mulch on it or cover crops, whatever it is. Because a totally bare garden looks really weird. But for whatever reason, whatever trick of psychology, that doesn't seem to apply to raised beds. I don't think this is just me because I see it all the time. In the off season or just when we get a little bit lazy and haven't filled in our beds, raised beds end up empty. They end up fallow, right? And this dirt should be growing. It should be creating life. And that's because one fundamental difference between a raised bed and a pot is that a raised bed is really more like a in-ground garden. It can grow life. It can be a living ecosystem. That's what we want for it. We should always have something growing in there. We should never have bare dirt like this. Sorry for the absolute mess in this area. As you can probably tell, I'm about to fill up this last raised bed here with some soil for growing peppers and eggplants. Super, super excited about it. And it made me think of a little bit of advice I once got from my dad when I first started growing fruit trees. He said to me, when you go to plant that tree, make sure you are spending more money on the soil you're putting the tree into, amending that ground, than you are actually spending on the tree itself. The soil matters more. And I think that's actually not that great of advice for fruit trees. We'll get into that another day. Sorry, Dad, love you, but I don't think it actually makes sense. But it's really, really good advice for raised beds. If you have the option of spending $20 on a cedar raised bed versus $200 on a beautiful metal raised bed, and you put some of those savings into filling the cheap raised bed with really good soil, whether that's bagged soil or something you make yourself, and you fill up that expensive metal raised bed with logs, I absolutely believe, and 100% my experience backs this up, that the cheap bed with good soil is going to run circles around the expensive bed with meh or bad soil. Now, don't get me wrong, you may have a specific aesthetic in mind. You want those beautiful beds. Totally, that is valid in my mind. There's no wrong way to garden. Go for it. But I suspect most folks watching this channel want to grow lots of vegetables. Maybe that's you. You want to grow lots of food, in which case I strongly recommend, if you have a fixed budget, spend less on the bed and more on the soil. That is how you're going to maximize production. All right, for our last bonus tip of the day, I want you to notice something real quick. I want you to notice this beautiful lemon balm that I absolutely adore and how it is not growing in a raised bed, how it is growing in one of these contained fabric grow bags in a pot. And the reason for that is I have actually very stupidly tried to grow plants like lemon balm and mint in open bottom raised beds. Now, luckily, it wasn't a total disaster because I caught those plants and removed them before they spread everywhere. But I promise you, this is one of those problems that you just want to avoid entirely. Do a little research to make sure that whatever you're growing does not have a reputation for invasiveness before you put it in an open bottom raised bed. You'll be glad that you did. And with that, just want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps. I hope you're so excited to get out there and put together your first raised bed garden. And as always, I hope to see you on the next one. Until next time, happy gardening, y'all.